HP Lion Roar PT2. Harry. Hermione said softly as she approached her friend in the small study they had arrived a few days ago. Harry was looking over some of Dumbledore's notes while Neville and Daphne were sparring. "What's up, Hermione?" Harry saw his bookworm best friend fidgeting nervously. "I know we plan to go to London tomorrow to get clothes and things, but I was wondering, I mean since we'll already be in London and all, if we could go see my parents. I haven't been able to talk to them since last year, and they must be worried. I thought about sending Dobby, but..." "You want to see them for yourself?" Harry smiled, and Hermione sighed with relief. She knew at that moment that she was going to get to see her mother and father. Hermione knew how high Harry valued family, especially since he had never really had his own. "I'm just so worried for them. I mean, they have no way to defend themselves," Hermione began as she sat in one of the comfortable chintz chairs. "You know that there's probably Death Eaters staked out there waiting for us to show up," Harry pointed out. Hermione was so overjoyed that she missed the glint in Harry's eye. "I figured that," Hermione said, standing up again, and began pacing. "I thought we could go at night. We could disillusion ourselves, since there's no way we'd all fit under your cloak. Then we could cut through the Myersons' yard and into my parents' backyard if we go to the front door. Any Death Eaters watching my family's home would likely notice the door opening and no one knocking on it, or my parents leaving. It'd be rather suspicious. The backyard is fenced, and there are no trees for them to hide in. A few quick revealing spells and we should be able to get in to see Mum and Dad with no problems." "How long have you been thinking about this?" Harry smiled. It was clear that Hermione had probably had a whole speech prepared in case he was unwilling to allow them to go to her parents' home. "Just a few days. Since we got here," Hermione replied. "Hey," Neville said as he and a very tired and sweaty-looking Daphne joined the two. "I think Neville and I are about dead even. He's powerful, but I think I have a better repertoire of spells to draw from." Daphne grinned, giving the boy a playful shove. "You have got to teach me that leadening spell. Making it near impossible for a Death Eater to move, or raise his wand would be so awesome." Neville grinned, wiping his brow on his sleeve. "What are you two walking about?" Daphne asked as she kissed her boyfriend. "Making grand plans to take down our enemies. Actually, we were discussing going to see my parents tomorrow." Hermione smiled. She was very happy that Harry had agreed to her plan. Daphne's smile, on the other hand, melted away. "What? Why does she get to see her family and I don't? Why are we going to her house and not mine? What about Neville? Will he get to see his grandmother tomorrow too?" "Daphne, calm down," Harry said, reaching out for his girlfriend's hand. Daphne snatched it away quickly as she grew angrier. "I'm not going to calm down. I've lost my best friend and my sister. Why does Hermione get to go see her family? Neville and I want to see our families too." "And you will," Harry snapped. Daphne, who was on the verge of tears, looked up into her boyfriend's irritated face as he got out of his chair and came to her. He took her hands gently and made her look into his eyes. "You're going to see your mum and dad very soon. I promise you that. But we can't just go marching up the front walk." Before Hermione asked me, I was already trying to figure out how we could get to visit all your families. Especially yours and Neville's. We've sent Dobby with letters, but we couldn't send him to Hermione's parents because they're muggles. It might freak them out a bit, and we can't send Hedwig. Her family lives just outside of London, and since we're already planning a trip there tomorrow, it won't be too difficult to stop by. I promise you we're going to see you parents as soon as possible. Daphne's anger faded and she nodded. She looked to Hermione. I'm sorry. I know. Hermione said, crossing the room to hug her friend. I completely understand. I'll make sure that we get to see you parents. And yours to Neville. She smiled over her shoulder. We don't need to worry ourselves. Neville smiled easily. She more or less told me to stay away unless it was an emergency. So long as I can send letters, she's fine. Okay, now I want to run through our plans again. Harry smiled at them all. The next morning saw the 4 teens preparing for their trip into London. Dobby had cleaned all their clothes. With the exception of Harry, they had been wearing their school uniforms. Hermione had managed to transfigure their clothes to look as Muggle as possible, so as not to draw attention to themselves. The previous night, Harry had managed to open the safe where Dumbledore's letter had indicated he'd left them money. He'd been worried that it was all going to be wizarding money, which would have made shopping very difficult, but it seemed that Dumbledore had foreseen the need for Muggle money. And Harry was pleasantly surprised to find a very large stack of pounds. They decided to wait until 11 o'clock, as London would be very busy, and they could blend into the large crowds. They had only one problem. Neither Neville or Daphne had really spent any time in London outside of Diagon Alley. Hermione and Harry had thought about using King's Cross Station as an apparition point, but Daphne had only ever used the flue on platform 9 3/4. So it was decided that Harry would side along apparate Daphne, while Neville would let Hermione lead him into London. At 11, Harry, Hermione, Neville and Daphne stepped into the small garden behind the Dumbledore house. Remember, if we get separated for any reason, apparate right back here. Harry said, making sure his wand was hidden up his sleeve. The others nodded their understanding. This isn't a pleasure trip. He looked at the girls. We get what we need and we move on as quickly as we can. I think we can all agree on that. Neville smiled. Though it's highly unlikely that Death Eaters will be roaming Muggle London. Let's do what we need to. Hermione said, eagerly anticipating the visit to her parents. They had all decided that once they were in London they wouldn't use magic, except to shrink their purchases. They thought it best to do all they could not to draw attention to themselves. All right. Harry said, offering his arm to Daphne, who took it with a smile. Harry had chosen the point where they would apparate to. A small hamburger restaurant that Hagrid had taken him to what felt like a lifetime ago. It turned out that Hermione knew the place as well. The two couples appeared with small whip cracks in the alley behind the restaurant. What is that awful smell? Daphne said, gagging. I'm going to guess it's urine. Harry said with a small smile. It's likely homeless people come here to rummage through the trash for food. We should get moving. Hermione urged, leading Neville out by the hand. Harry and Daphne followed right behind. The teens allowed themselves to be swallowed up by the steady stream of Muggles on the march to whatever errands they needed to accomplish. Daphne had never been in Muggle London before. She'd been in a few Muggle towns before, but never a city like this. She couldn't stop from gaping at the buildings, or the lighted signs. Even the hundreds of cars clogging the streets captured her mind. Several times, Harry had to tug on her arm to get her to move again. You're nearly as bad as Mr. Weasley. Harry smirked. It's just so busy. Daphne said, waving around her. We're here. Hermione shouted over her shoulder. She was standing in front of the entrance to a small shopping mall. Should we split up? Neville asked. Girls go to the Girls' area and we get our things. Not a bad idea. Harry shrugged. We could get our shopping done quicker. Daphne pointed out. Okay. Hermione nodded. 2 hours and we met over there in the food court. Any trouble, apparate out and then activate your Galleon. Harry reminded. He gave Daphne a quick kiss and then he and Neville began searching for a men's department while Daphne and Hermione went off to find something a bit more feminine. Whoa, Harry. Neville elbowed his friend. Should we take a look? Neville had spotted a sporting goods store, with a large display of survival knives in the window. You're becoming really obsessed with edged weapons. Harry grinned. Saved my life twice now. Can you blame me? Not really. It might not be bad to stop in and take a look. We might find some stuff we can use, besides knives, I mean. Like that crossbow. Clothing first, Neville. Man. Does Hermione know you pine over weapons? Daphne was truly hating life at the moment. As they were on a time schedule, she knew she would never have the time to truly browse and even try on all the clothes that the store offered. The first thing the two girls did was go right for the lingerie area. Knickers and bras were top priority for the two. Hermione did allow them a few minutes to peruse some of the more tasteful offerings, saying that it would be a nice treat for the boys at some point. Especially if they might have something to celebrate. Daphne admitted that she really missed her favorite black slip that she would often wear for Harry in the room of requirement. Then it was on to the rest. Jeans and shirts of all kinds. Daphne even slipped a dress or two, as well as a few choice skirts that she passed. The two took adjoining dressing rooms to make sure their choices fit well. We haven't really had a chance to talk with all that's going on. How are things with you and Harry? Hermione asked while she pulled on a pair of jeans that turned out to be a bit snug. Well, you've pretty much seen. He's always going over Dumbledore's notebooks, like it's going to change and all the answers are going to come spewing out. He does get pretty focused, but that's not what I meant. You guys kind of forgot the silencing charm last night. Daphne froze in the middle of trying on a new bra. She felt her whole body burn crimson. I'm happy for you guys. With everything happening around us, it's really good to have that strong connection. I just never had any idea how much stamina Harry had, or how strong your lungs were. Daphne wanted to disappear. She heard Hermione struggling to not laugh from the next room. I am so going to hurt you. Daphne growled. Like I haven't heard that before. I could tell your parents about your living arrangements with Neville. Perhaps your father would be interested to know exactly how well Neville uses his wand. You wouldn't. Hermione's voice sounded horrified. Try me. Daphne chuckled, realizing she had Hermione in her clutches. Then there would be only one thing to do. I'm sure Dobby would be up for taking a very special letter to your father, with a few of the more interesting things I've heard you shout. Daphne began laughing. I don't shout anything. You're right. Hermione agreed. There's no way you could form words be that lacking in breath. There was a pause and then Hermione said. Okay, is it bad that I just kind of creeped myself out with that? The two girls broke down into a fit of laughter as they finished trying on clothing. When they were done, they took relatively smaller piles of clothing out with them, and both selected a few pairs of shoes, best suited for running or hiking. Though Daphne did select a nice pair of 4-inch heels. What? She asked Hermione, who was giving her a rather pointed look. They go with my skirts and the dress. When are you ever going to wear that stuff? You might be surprised. Daphne smirked as she made her way to the counter, followed by Hermione, who had selected a pair of simple black pumps. What? Hermione asked when Daphne gave her a grin. It never hurts to be prepared. Both girls began laughing again. Neville and Harry, in true male fashion, were able to get jeans, shirts, jackets, shoes, sock and even underwear and get back to the sporting goods store in under an hour. Neville had already chosen 3 knives before Harry was finished looking at rucksacks and survival gear. And I'll throw in sharpening stones, the proprietor was telling Neville, who was testing the weight of one of the bigger knives. What do you think, Harry? He asked, handing the knife to Harry. Not bad, Harry said, hefting the blade. Do you have first aid kits? Yeah, the older man smiled, walking down the counter. He pointed out a few different kits, each having more or less the same stuff. Harry asked for half a dozen of the largest kits, and a few other items that Harry thought might come in handy, including a rather nice knife with a no-slip handle that looked rather nice. Smart thinking, Neville whispered out the corner of his mouth as Harry paid for his items. The old man then took care of Neville's choices. It's not like we can go into Diagon Alley for healing drafts and the like, Harry said as they left the store. I don't know how extensive your healing knowledge is. Now that I think about it, we should all try to learn some. Snape did show me a good one, but I think it's for more severe wounds. I hope I never have to use it, to be honest. Me too, Neville said, his good mood fading. Are you sure we should be going to Hermione's tonight? You're worried? Of course I am. I feel like we're about to walk into a trap. Except we're going to be springing the trap. Neville looked sharply at Harry and a smile broke onto his face. You're expecting a fight? Hoping for it? Harry shrugged. I've been thinking a lot about Hermione, and I think it's time she sees what it means to fight a war. She's scared about fighting, which I understand, but there's something else going on. It isn't just that she's afraid to kill. I think she's afraid she might like it. How can you even think that about her? Neville turned, blocking Harry's path and looking very angry. Calm down, Nevada, Harry said, raising a hand. I know that she would never feel that, as do you. But somewhere in Hermione's humongous mind, she's afraid she might become like them. She hasn't had to do what we have. She hasn't truly been forced with that choice. I hope that she never has to make it, but you and I both know it's not going to happen. My first goal is to make sure the Grangers are safe, and maybe talk them into leaving the country or something. Hermione needs to have a clear head. But you think we're going to have a fight on our hands, don't you? Harry grimaced a bit, and then nodded. I think it's time we start thinning his numbers. Even if it's 1 or 2. If we can capture one, maybe we might be able to get a bit of information out of them. You don't really think we'll be able to break one of them, do you? No, and I'm not going to torture anyone. I'm not one of those bastards, and I'm going to do everything in my power to see that myself, and the rest of us never become like them. I'll ask, but I won't beat it out of them. I'm hoping that they might want to brag, you know. Neville smirked and nodded, as he returned to Harry's side as they headed to their arranged meeting area with the girls. Should we get some food while we're waiting for them? Harry asked. Neville's mouth was watering simply from the sensuous smells around him. He barely nodded before following Harry to one of the restaurants. By the time they had their orders, the girls had appeared. Oh, thank you. Daphne kissed her boyfriend. We were just talking about getting lunch. The teens ate quickly, each of them keeping their eyes open for anything suspicious. It seemed that luck was with them, as nothing appeared at all unusual. When they finished, they decided to find a vacant alley where they wouldn't be seen to deal with their purchases. Okay, Hermione said as she took out her wand. Since you and Neville still have the trace on you, I'll shrink the bags. Wait a second. Neville said, diving into one of the bags and pulling a couple of the knives he had purchased out. You should be able to hide this under your shirt, he said, handing the smaller of the two to Hermione. She gave him a questioning look, and he simply shrugged. I'd rather you have it and not need it. The bushy-haired girl gave a soft smile, and tucked the knife in the back of her jeans, pulling her jumper over it. Daphne made sure it wasn't obvious, and then Hermione went to work on shrinking their shopping. Once they had each stuffed their pockets with their now diminished purchases, they waited a few moments, in case they might be tracked. Once they were sure that no one was coming, and there'd be no fight, Hermione led them out of the alley and down to the nearest subway station. The trip was long, especially since they were going as Muggles. 3 trains and 4 buses, with some rather long waits in between. Harry and Neville both nearly had rib injuries from laughing when they actually missed a connection, and Hermione swore. It's not funny, she said. We have to wait 45 minutes now. It was with serious relief that the 4 teens departed from the final bus. Mum and Dad won't be home for another hour, Hermione said, looking at her watch. There's a park not far from the house. We can go there and wait. I don't know about being in the open like that, Harry said, and both Daphne and Neville agreed. Well, there's public library not too far from here. Is anyone surprised that her second suggestion was a library? Daphne chuckled. I'm actually shocked it wasn't her first, Harry admitted with a grin. Hermione simply huffed and began leading them to the library she had spent so much time in as a child. They weren't bored by any means. Both Neville and Daphne enjoyed getting to listen to some Muggle rock music. While both Harry and Hermione scanned the Muggle newspapers for any news that might give them a clue as to what Voldemort was up to. Unfortunately, there were no suspicious accidents, or deaths. It looked as if nothing had happened at all. Kind of strange, isn't it? Harry said, folding up a paper. Not really, Hermione sighed. It's likely that he's busy reorganizing his new government. He may not have anticipated all he would have to do, and the appointments he would have to make. Although, I'm sure you're still his #1 priority. All this speculation and guessing makes me kind of long for the days of glimpses into his head. Thwack. Hermione's angry gaze sent shivers down Harry's spine, and he had to look away at once. Sorry. You'd better not let me ever hear that again, Hermione warned. Harry nodded his understanding, and Hermione checked her watch. They should be home now. We should get the others, and start making our way there. Harry agreed, and they sought out their significant others, who were listening to a CD of the Beatles, and discussed the music quite thoughtfully. Do you think we can get one of those things and some music to listen to? Neville asked as they stepped out into the street. It was really fun listening to such diverse music. I still like the Rolling Stones the best, Daphne said, taking Harry's hand, and looking up the street for any signs they were being watched. That's because you're mental, Neville grinned. The Beatles were clearly better. Oh gods, what did we let happen? Harry asked, looking at Hermione, who looked just as befuddled. Finally she shook her head, and began leading the group again. Thankfully it wasn't a long walk, and when Hermione judged them to be about halfway, she guided them into a small area between 2 hedgerows and disillusioned them all. As they could no longer see one another, they had locked hands, and Hermione once again led them out into the street. The Meyerson house was a very elegant-looking home, with a large, prim front garden. Hermione led them beside the large cream-colored house and into the back garden where a large wooden fence separated the Meyerson property from the Grangers. "Humanis Revelio," Hermione whispered. Harry was peeking through two of the slats of the fence and saw two red outlines showing through the Granger home. One of them looked to be busy in the kitchen area, while the other was still in another room. "Dad's watching the news. Looks like Mum is making supper," Hermione said. "Hold it," Harry said, noticing something else. Over by the woodpile. They all did their best to try to catch a glimpse of what Harry had spotted. "Stay here," he said, reaching up to the top of the fence and pulling himself over. Neville finally caught on to what had Harry's attention. Another red glowing figure was behind the woodpile. As Harry jumped the fence, the figure stood, and Neville realized they were either hidden with an invisibility cloak, or disillusioned themselves. "Petrificus totalis," Harry snapped, the figure locking up and falling over with a loud thud. Hermione and the others were over the fence in an instant. "Damn it, Harry. The trace. Oh. I forgot." Harry sounded remorseful. Hermione took away the disillusionment charms on them all, and Harry bent over the still glowing figure on the ground. He checked for a cloak, but only felt the person's face. "Disillusioned," Harry said. Hermione countered the charm, and they found themselves staring into the eyes of Stan Shunpike. "I don't believe this," Harry groaned. "Stan. Look at his eyes, Harry," Daphne pointed out. "Hermione." The 4 teens turned and saw a woman that looked very much like Hermione. "Mum!" Hermione shouted, running her mother's arms. "He's imperviused," Daphne said to Harry as she watched Hermione reunite with her mother and father. "So what do we do?" Neville asked. "Obliviate him. Send him away from here," Harry said. Daphne nodded, and did the deed. Stan, under Daphne's orders, recast the disillusionment charm, and left. "I think it's time for introductions," Hermione's father said, still hugging his daughter. "Let's do that inside." Harry smiled, taking Daphne's hand. The whole group went into the house, and Mr. Granger greeted Neville like a very old friend, giving the younger man a firm handshake and a hearty back slap. "Mum, Dad, this is Harry Potter and Daphne Greengrass." Hermione smiled, introducing the 2 newcomers. "At last, we finally get to meet the infamous Harry Potter." Mrs. Granger smiled, offering her hand. "We've had a few debates over the idea that Hermione was making you up. Then Neville gave us a bit more insight, but it still seemed as if you couldn't be a real person." Mr. Granger smiled, shaking Harry's hand when his wife had finished. "I'm sure they exaggerated a lot." Harry smiled softly, feeling suddenly warm in the face. Hermione gave him a rather offended look, and he simply smiled at her. "So why are you here now?" Mrs. Granger asked. "Though school didn't let out for the summer holiday for another 3 weeks. It's kind of a long story." Hermione hesitated. "Do you remember the long talk we had at Christmas time about the wizard terrorist?" Both adults nodded, and Hermione looked sheepish. "I wasn't entirely forthcoming about some pertinent information." "What do you mean?" Mr. Granger asked, looking between Hermione and Neville suspiciously. "We'd better sit down," Neville suggested. Over the next hour, the Grangers got the full story about the Wizarding War, and Hermione's role in it. To say they were shocked was an understatement, and yet, they both admitted to being very proud of their only child. "As frightened as I am for you, sweetie, I can't help but being so very proud." Mrs. Granger smiled, taking her daughter's hands affectionately. So you're going to build an army to fight this maniac all by yourselves? Mr. Granger asked. I've become kind of connected over the last couple of years. Harry shrugged. But we have another problem right now. You're both in danger from Voldemort's minions. He'll do anything to get his claws on me, including killing you. He knows Hermione's my best friend, and he'll use anything he thinks might get me to come out of hiding just so he can finish me off. So what are we supposed to do? Mr. Granger asked, feeling a shiver of fear run down his spine. He would do anything to protect his family. Leave the country. As soon as possible. Harry said. I am not leaving without you. Mrs. Granger said to Hermione, who began tearing up. You have to. She said. Harry's right. To Voldemort, you're nothing more than cattle to be slaughtered. Daphne suddenly stood up and began looking out the front window into the darkening street. Harry noticed and stood as well, going to her side while the Grangers discussed the idea of fleeing. What is it? Harry asked Daphne. She shook her head, still keeping her eyes focused on the street. I don't know. I swore I heard something. What do you think it was? Harry asked, now scanning the street as well. Before Daphne could answer, however, a flash of purple light caught Harry's eye. Moving on instinct, he grabbed Daphne and tackled her to the floor while shouting for everyone else to take cover. The front window and much of the wall holding it exploded as the spell made contact. Shards of glass and splintered wood and chunks of plaster rained down on them all. How'd they find us? Hermione shouted, pulling her wand. Harry. Neville shouted. We still have the trace. Damn it. Harry cursed inwardly. Hermione, Daphne, protect the Grangers. Neville, you're with me. Neville began to get to his feet when Daphne shouted him back down. Oh no you don't. Neville can protect Hermione's family. I'm going with you, and don't even try to say no, or you'll never see me naked again. Harry didn't even want to try and argue, as this was not the place or time. He simply nodded and got to his feet with Daphne right behind him. They had barely taken 3 steps when the sliding glass door that led to the back garden exploded inward, and Mrs. Granger shrieked in fear. Hermione spun on her knees and sent 3 stunning jinxes, all of which failed to make contact. Neville backed her up with a powerful blasting hex, which caught the lead Death Eater in the face, sending bone and flesh all over what remained of the Granger's wall. Neville had no time to celebrate as he was thrown off his feet as a blasting hex landed just in front of him, sending him sailing through a wall and into the Granger study. Neville! Mr. Granger shouted, getting to his feet to check on the boy. Hermione placed herself between her mother and the 2 Death Eaters who were taking aim with their wands. Hermione! Mrs. Granger said, her voice shaking with fright. Hermione raised her own wand. All she could think about was protecting her mother and father, and Neville, who might be badly injured. Conf Ringo. The curse hit the first robed figure in the chest, knocking him into his partner. Hermione rushed forward so as not to give the Death Eater time to recover. She sent a cutting jinx at the robed figure, catching him above the wrist of his wand hand. There was a terrible high-pitched shriek of pain and the figure fell down, clutching their suddenly amputated wrist. Hermione kicked the figure over, and tore the mask off the Death Eater, shock stopping her cold. Pansy! Daphne was right on Harry's heels as he launched himself into the front yard where 4 Death Eaters were waiting them. Daphne was able to sneak a spell around Harry, catching one of the Death Eaters by surprise. He was knocked sideways into the Death Eater next to him, and the both fell in a heap on the lush lawn. Harry began trading spells with the largest Death Eater, who apparently was the leader of this little group. The last robed and masked terrorist appeared confused on what should be done. It looked as if he was waiting for an order, which gave Daphne the opportunity to disarm him and snap his wand. The lead Death Eater didn't waste his breath trying to taunt Harry. In fact, it appeared he had listened to stories and was keeping his focus solely on the boy who lived. That had been his fatal mistake. Having forgotten about the girl, he didn't realize that she had gotten behind him, and stunned him cold. However, the first two that she had knocked over had regained their feet, and sent stunners of their own. Harry's shield was quite formidable however, and he managed to get one up before Daphne was struck down. Daphne, remembering the spell that Neville wanted to learn from her, made a quick slashing motion, and the electric blue spell hit the Death Eater in the forehead. He suddenly toppled over, his head making a rather deep impact in the soft soil of the Granger's lawn. "I can't move my damned head," he shouted, his arms flailing about. Daphne turned in time to see Harry blasting the last Death Eater into a car, his head snapping back rather violently, before he slumped to the ground. "If you want to live, I'd suggest you leave, and never come back. And I mean don't bother going to your master. He'll kill you a lot slower than I would." The Death Eater that Daphne had disarmed, and who had pretty uselessly watched the battle, stared for a long moment at Harry before turning and running away. "Why'd you let them go?" Daphne asked, taking the wand of the Death Eater whose head was too heavy to lift and snapping it in two. "It was a kid. Couldn't you tell by how they were too shocked to do anything? When Hogwarts was taken over, we saw a few Death Eaters that might have been pretty young." Daphne sighed. "Dumbledore and I ran into a bunch of kids when we got there. 4th years at the least," Harry said as he checked the pulse of the Death Eater by the car. "He'll live." "Maybe," Harry said, handing his wand to Daphne. "Do you want to see who it is?" "No," Harry said quickly. "I'd rather not know. I think it's better that way." "So what do we do with that one?" Daphne nodded towards lead head. "Stupefy!" Harry shouted, knocking the Death Eater out. He then led Daphne back into the house. Neville and Mr. Granger were emerging from a rather large hole in the wall, Neville being supported by Mr. Granger. "You okay?" Harry asked. Neville nodded, though he grimaced. "I don't think they liked me killing their friend." "Where's Hermione?" Daphne asked. "We're out here," Mrs. Granger called out. They all went into the backyard where Hermione was standing over a shaking girl, who was clutching a bloody stump. Hermione's eyes were wide and intense as she aimed her wand right between the girl's eyes. "Hermione? Sweetie?" Mr. Granger asked, slowly approaching his daughter. Neville also came to his girlfriend's side, and placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's over, love. We won. Everyone's all right. You did good." Slowly, Hermione's arm lowered and slowed her father to embrace her. The Grangers went back into the house, while Harry, Daphne and Neville tended to the girl. "I don't believe it," Daphne said as she recognized the girl. "Is he getting that desperate that he'll let anyone join his army?" Harry too had to wonder about the Dark Lord's recruitment as he looked at a very scared and pale Pansy Parkinson. "I'm going to give you one opportunity, Parkinson," Harry said, crouching in front of the girl. "Tell me what's going on with your master. How did you find us?" "The name's been tabooed," Pansy said shakily, though she was still trying to sound tough. "I thought you weren't following Draco anymore. I thought you were over him. Why'd you take the mark?" Daphne asked. "I didn't have a choice." Pansy began to break down. "He swore to end the lives of my family. He said all Slytherins had a duty to join him, and made it clear that it wasn't a request. What's happening to the rest of the students at Hogwarts? Harry asked. Re-education. Pansy said. They'll learn to follow his law, or they'll be killed. What about Tracy, and my sister? Daphne asked, falling to her knees before her former roommate. Pansy merely shook her head. I haven't seen them. Daphne began to cry, and Harry pulled her away. I can't let you go back to him, Harry said, and Pansy looked up, fear shining in her eyes. Are you going to obliviate? Harry and the other teens didn't allow the Grangers time to pack more than their wallets and a few essentials. Harry handed Hermione's father a stack of pounds and with one final hug to their daughter and her promise to let them know when it was safe to return. The Grangers got in their car and headed for the airport, just as the sound of police sirens were getting louder. Hermione watched her mother and father drive away until they were out of sight before turning to her friends, who were patiently waiting for her, and leading them all back into her house. We're just going to leave these guys? Neville asked as they passed the lead Death Eater, who had been thrown bodily into the Granger's car. I'm not taking them with us, Daphne said, following Harry back into the ruined house, where Hermione had already headed. They're not going to bother anyone, Harry said flatly. We snapped their wands, and only one of them is in any condition to answer questions. Once he wakes up, that is. Harry nodded towards old Leadhead, who was still bent over with his head stuck in the lawn. Neville regarded the Death Eater for a moment before shrugging and following his friends. Hermione was in the backyard, staring at Pansy's now unconscious form, pointedly avoiding the boy next to her. Her whole body trembled as she recalled blasting the boy's chest apart as he and Pansy had stormed into the back door, intent on killing her and her mother and father. Hermione, Neville asked softly. We have to get out of here. I did it, she whispered shakily. I killed that boy, and I didn't think. Let's go, Harry said. We'll deal with all this back home. Neville nodded and wrapped his arms around his girlfriend and operated her away, with Daphne and Harry behind them. The four went inside and sat down in the sitting room. Hermione had broken down and was sobbing in Neville's arms by the time Harry had sat down. I didn't mean to do it, Hermione gasped. I just acted. I didn't think about what I was casting. And because of it, you and your parents are still alive, Harry said, leaning forward to look into Hermione's tear-filled eyes. Now you understand what it really feels like, and now you know that this isn't some sort of game. If you hesitate, if you try to think of a humane way to stop our enemies, we die. You didn't kill anyone out there, Daphne pointed out. And what was with obliviating them? They were kids. I think most of them might have been younger than we were, Harry said. I obliviate them, first because if they go back to Voldemort. Daphne had slapped her hand over Harry's mouth. Didn't you hear, Pansy? The name's taboo. What does that mean? Harry asked, pulling Daphne's hand away from his mouth. It's sort of like the trace, Neville said. If you say his name, then they can track your location and come for you. It's really old magic. But we've said his name tons since we've been here, Harry pointed out. Hermione sat up at this and they all looked at each other. Immediately they all went through the house, looking for any signs that someone had been there, before congregating in front of the picture window in the sitting room again. Could Dumbledore have warded this place against something like that? Harry asked. I don't think it was Dumbledore who did the protections on this place, Daphne said. Huh. When he died, any wards or protections fueled by his magic would have fallen. Magic like that is tied to your life force. When you die, so does the magic. I think he had someone else cast the protections on this place. Hermione explained. She still looked very upset by what had happened earlier that evening, but having an opportunity to explain something complicated seemed to do her a bit of good. That doesn't answer the question about if we're protected from the taboo, Neville said. Even if we are, I think we should get in the habit of not saying that name. If we slip while we're out, we could find ourselves in a load of trouble, Daphne said. Fine, Harry said. Just so we're clear, is this our plan? Neville asked. I mean, are we going to obliviate anyone we don't kill? We're not going to kill everyone, Harry said, shaking his head. We're not butchers, they are. I know that, Neville said as if he were insulted. You said we needed information, and I had every intention of stunning whomever I could. But that's... I'm sorry, Nevada, Harry said, cutting the other man off. I didn't mean it like it sounded. If it means we can get information from someone, and possibly protect them from torture or worse by alleviating them, then yeah, that's our plan. I don't see why. Daphne sighed. They wouldn't give us the same consideration. I know. Harry smiled softly. And that's why we're far better than they are. Master Harry is being home. Dobby's delighted squeaky voice came from the kitchen as the little elf poked his head out and beckoned them all with his hand. Dobby has prepared supper, and had brought news. The 4 teens didn't hesitate and followed the diminutive creature into the kitchen where a wonderful-looking supper of roast chicken awaited them. As they sat down, and began dishing themselves, Harry invited Dobby to join them. Dobby's excitement was quite evident as he hugged Harry's leg so tightly, it felt as if the circulation had been cut off. So Dobby, you said you had news? Daphne asked once everyone was settled and eating. Dobby nodded his head excitedly and popped away for a brief second before reappearing carrying 3 letters. He handed one to Neville, Daphne, and Harry respectively. Harry's letter came from Victor Crumb. Harry. I have been in contact with several high-ranking officials in Bulgaria's ministry, and they seem very set on keeping out of your country's troubles. I am sorry, but I am not as important as you believe me to be, and cannot rally an entire country to your cause. Do not despair, however, as I have been able to gather more than a few sympathizers to your plight. We are ready to fight at your side at a moment's notice. I will continue to do all I can to rally more supporters, but it is a difficult thing to do. Relations between our 2 countries has not been very good in these last 2 years. If I can help you in any way, please send your house elf again, and I will do all in my power to help. Your friend, Victor. Damn. Harry said, passing the letter to Hermione, whose face mirrored Harry's disappointment. Well, at least he's trying, Hermione said, passing the letter back. And he might be able to get us things we can't get for ourselves. We need things, potion ingredients, and the like. Dumbledore's potions lab is stocked pretty well, Neville said, still reading his own letter. Not for making healing drafts, and blood replenishes and things like that, Hermione pointed out, returning to her supper. Yes. Daphne shouted, launching herself out of her chair, and dancing about the kitchen. What? Everyone asked in surprised curiosity. Tori's alive. Daphne. It is such a relief to know that you are indeed alive and well. We have been so extremely worried over all that has transpired. At the moment, we are still at home, as there has been no need for us to flee, not to mention the simple fact that I do not wish to leave. I think your choice to stand and fight has stirred something in both myself and your father. He has been meeting with other individuals lately, though I am unsure of what they are discussing, and you know your father, he will not say. But if I had to guess, there might be a little friction in our new Lord's government. I only write this because I know it will not be intercepted. Brilliant idea using the elf. Now, I must warn you, my sweet daughter, if you find yourself in trouble, or just need a place to go, do not come here at all. Your father has learned that we are being observed. He does not believe our ruse has worked. But, there are places you know that should be safe, if you think about it hard enough. In closing, stay safe, and look after yourself and whomever might be with you. Give your love our very best and know that we are very proud of you. I was just about to finish this when an owl flew in. Your sister is alive and safe. She would not say where she is, but she has sworn that she will contact us again soon and not to worry. Clearly the fates are smiling upon us. All my love. Mum. How? Hermione asked. Daphne shrugged. But I have to believe that if she's alive, then Tracy is as well. They made it, and they're safe. Harry got up and swept Daphne into his arms, swinging her around. He was just as happy as she was to learn that Astoria was alive. He vowed that he would see them reunited if it took his dying breath. What was in your letter, Nev? Harry asked as he and Daphne returned to the table. Gran says not to come there, she's seen Death Eaters all around. She thinks that they expect us to show up there sometime. Neville sighed. You think she's in danger? Hermione asked. Neville grinned and shook his head. I'd actually be more worried for the Death Eaters. If they try anything. Neville let the thought hang, grinning madly. What's our next move? Daphne asked, still giddy from the good news. I don't really know. Harry admitted. I want to get out and do something, but without some kind of information, I'm not sure exactly what to do. It's times like these I really miss. Harry's eyes grew large and he suddenly smacked his head. So stupid! He shouted. His three friends, and a rather frightened-looking house elf all stared at Harry. If there's anyone who might know where Sirius is or how to get in contact with him, it's the Weasleys. Oh my gods! Hermione shouted, her hands going to her mouth in embarrassment. I didn't even think of them. Dobby, I know you've done so much, but could you deliver another letter me? Harry asked. The tiny elf puffed out his chest and gave a small salute as he hopped off his chair and followed Harry out of the kitchen and into the study where Harry scribbled a quick note. Please take this to the Weasleys. Do not give it to anyone except Mr. or Mrs. Weasley, and only if you're sure that no one is watching. Let them know that we're all right, but we need their help. Stay there until you get a response, and help them if they need anything. Dobby will not fail his friend and master. Dobby said sternly and with more conviction than Harry believed possible. Dobby clutched the letter to his chest and with a soft pop vanished. Harry stood up once again, confident that he would be seeing his godfather quite soon. Lucius Malfoy had only been out of Azkaban a week. He was desperately tired, and felt sick nearly all of the time. That's why he was surprised when his master had given him the very important task of killing 2 traitors who had defected the Death Eater ranks and fled the country. Lord Voldemort wished to make an example of the traitors, and told Malfoy to bring back their heads. When Lucius had asked the identities of the traitors, his master had merely smiled and assured his servant that he would recognize them as soon as he saw them. He then ordered a very angry Rudolphus Lestrange to accompany him in his task. Following the instructions his master had given, and fueled by the fear of failure, Lucius followed his companion to the Hogwarts grounds and out the great iron gate. Once they were outside the wards, Rudolphus produced a portkaya that would take them close to their prey. Still severely weakened from his stint in the wizarding prison, Lucius vomited up nearly everything he'd eaten in the last week upon landing. Rudolphus merely chuckled at the former rich man's plight, taking great joy in seeing the once arrogant Malfoy reduced to looking no better than a drunk beggar in the street. "Let's move it, Malfoy. I've got much bigger fish to fry, and this is keeping me from tracking down Longbottom. It still stuns me that both your wife, who was admittedly one of the most powerful witches I have ever known, and your brother, who was no slouch himself, were down in by a boy. A boy that is supposed to be only a step above Squib if the rumors are to be believed." Malfoy choked out, still heaving on his hands and knees. Rudolphus violently haled Lucius to his feet, and pressed his nose to Lucius as he snarled. "Listen to me, you son of a bitch. Longbottom didn't use magic on my wife or my brother. He stabbed them. Slaughtered them like they were pigs. No one could have beaten either Bellatrix or Robespierre. The little shit got lucky, but his luck is run out. I'm going to get Longbottom, and then I'm going to take great pleasure in cutting out his heart with the very blade he killed my wife with, all while making him scream under the cruciatus. That's nice, but until then, get your filthy hands off me, before I end your line once and for all myself." Rudolphus felt something tapping his crotch, and looked down to see Malfoy had his wand pointed right at his jewels. He roughly shoved the Malfoy sire away from him with a disgusted look. "You always were a prick, Malfoy," Rudolphus grimaced, pulling his hood over his head. "This way." Lucius followed his companion through a heavily wooded area, up a small hill. They eventually came to a tiny village with 2 shops and a pub. Lucius could see a few houses nearby, but everything else was obscured by trees. "If I may be so bold to ask, where are we?" "Switzerland." Rudolphus smiled. "Our lost sheep were sent here a few weeks before Dumbledore was killed. We've had people out looking for them, and someone in this village reported their whereabouts in a small house not too far. We're going to see our informant and get the exact location and make sure they're still there. Once we find them, I will dispatch them just as our Lord has ordered," Malfoy said firmly. Rudolphus began laughing quietly to himself, and Lucius felt a wave of anxiety wash over him. He suddenly realized something else was going on here. As subtle as he could manage, Lucius gripped his wand tightly, and tugged it ever so slightly out of the ornate walking stick it normally resided in. The 2 men stepped into the filthy pub, and Lucius was at once overcome by the stench of stale beer and what he was sure was urine. Covering his mouth to keep from gagging, he followed Rudolphus into the pub where he noticed only a handful of patrons pointedly ignoring the newcomers. Rudolphus spoke in a heated whisper to the bartender before giving Lucius a wave to follow him. They stepped into the back room where a very skinny and dirty-looking man, who couldn't have been more than 17, was sleeping on a large wooden crate. "Hey, Rigby!" Rudolphus shouted, slapping the young man and knocking him to the floor with a loud heavy thud. "What the?" the boy shouted, scrambling to his feet, readying himself for a fight. He forgot that idea the moment he saw who had so rudely awoken him. "Did you come for the?" he began, but Rudolphus cut him off by presenting a large bag to the youth. "Your reward. Provided that the information proves accurate." "It is. They're still up there now. Saw them both just this afternoon." "How do we get there?" Rudolphus asked. "I can show you," the boy said, going for a cloak on a peg just behind Lucius. "Just tell us," Rudolphus snapped. The boy nodded and then explained how to get to the house. Once he was finished, Rudolphus handed over the bag of gold and promised that if their targets were not where they had just been told they were, he would be back to collect the gold again. Lestrange and Malfoy headed off into the darkening night to track down the defectors once again, Rudolphus chuckling to himself as they walked. Lucius was now certain that he was not fully informed as to what was going on. Taking no further chances, he took his wand out, and gripped it tightly, keeping a wary eye on his companion now. "We're close," Rudolphus said, pointing to a chimney that was just visible above the trees. "We got quickly and quietly. Make sure you check for wards. They're clever, these two." Lucius nodded, and he and Rudolphus split up, having decided that it would be for the best. This way, their quarry couldn't escape easily. Lucius used a few spells as he approached the house. There seemed to be no wards protecting the house, which surprised him to no end. If he had been trying to hide from the Dark Lord, he would have used every ward he could think of. Perhaps his prey had simply trusted someone else to protect them, or perhaps they were expected, and he and Lestrange were walking right into a trap. Slowly, he approached a window. Keeping himself low, so as not to be seen, Lucius peeked into the house. What he saw nearly stopped his heart cold. She was beautiful. More beautiful than he had ever remembered her looking. Tears sprang to his eyes as he suddenly realized why the Dark Lord had insisted that it must be him to carry out this assignment. He was not being given a chance to correct his past errors. He was still being punished. His loyalty was being called into question, and he knew now, without a single doubt, that he would fail. He could not kill his wife. "Mum." Lucius' eyes followed the voice of his son, and his heart jumped into his throat. They were together, his precious Narcissa and his son, Draco. He had been told they had died. He had grieved for them, desperately wishing he had only had a chance to tell them what they had truly meant to him. It had only been during his incarceration that he had finally understood and realized just how much his wife and son had truly meant to him, and now that he had seemingly lost them, his only desire was to set things right. And here it was. He had his chance to save them and run away from all the deception and death. He could save them and show them that he had changed. But time was short, and he had to act now. Lucius was on his feet, and in an instant he had smashed through the front door. Narcissa shrieked, while Draco went for a wand. "Wait!" Lucius cried out, holding up his hands. "I don't have time to explain, but we have to get out of here. Now." "You've brought them, haven't you?" Narcissa accused. "No, I was sent to kill you, but I wasn't told that it was you. He told me you both had perished in the siege," Lucius said adamantly. "I've been a fool. I need to make things right. We have to go now." He was looking into his son's eyes as he spoke. Draco kept his wand trained on his father, not daring to believe the man to be serious in his overtures. He saw something different in Draco. His eyes were haunted, almost empty, as if there was something eating away at his very soul. Unfortunately, that mystery would have to wait for now. Time was not their friend at this moment. "Please, Narcissa." Lucius turned to his wife. "I know that we've had our problems, and that I put things ahead of our family and ahead of our happiness. But please believe me when I tell you I want to fix it all. If you ever trusted me, I beg that you trust in me now." Narcissa stared with hopeful eyes at her husband, searching his face for any sign of deception. It was clear to her that she was looking at a broken man. Tears were beginning to fall down his unshaven face, and his shoulders sagged as she took a tentative step towards him. "Well done." The three Malfoys jumped at the voice of Rudolphus, who was leaning in the doorway. His wand was at the ready. Draco wasn't about to just roll over and allow anything to happen to his mother. He rolled to his right and was on his feet, his wand raised, the spell on his lips. Lestrange was much faster. Avada Kedavra. No. Narcissa shrieked as Draco was thrown to the floor, his life having been snuffed out for good. She ran to her child's side, and lifted him into her arms, pleading for him to somehow wake up and return to her. Expelliarmus. Lucius and Narcissa both found themselves without wands in the blink of an eye. Narcissa began sobbing while cradling her only child's head in her arms. "You bastard!" Lucius grimaced, his own guilt and sorrow overwhelming him. "That was my son you murdered." "My son? Oh, get over it, Malfoy, you're about to see him again." "Why?" Narcissa wailed from the floor. "Because you betrayed him," Rudolphus shouted over the hysterical woman's sobs. Lucius knelt beside his wife, wrapping his around her, tears streaming down his face. He looked up at Lestrange with bloodshot eyes, and all the contempt he could muster. "It is my dying wish that Longbottom kills you, and takes his time doing it." Rudolphus snarled, and with a flash of poison green light, Narcissa's sobs were silenced as she died in her husband's arms. Lucius gripped his dead wife's body tightly and wailed up to the heavens before he too was silenced forever. Rudolphus stepped over to where Lucius had fallen and delivered one final kick to the dead man's face before stomping out of the little house. Just before he activated the return portkey, Rudolphus set the house ablaze, and watched it burn for several minutes. The kills had been unsatisfactory. He longed for a real fight. He wanted Longbottom. If only his master would allow him to take that old crone, Augusta. Surely the boy would come for his only family. He was Potter's friend after all. Hell, it might bear unexpected fruit and Potter would accompany the pig. Patience, he told himself as he tapped the portkey with his wand. He knew it was only a matter of time before Longbottom lay dead at his feet, and his vengeance would be satisfied. The boy couldn't hide forever. Please like and subscribe.